Hello, Dr. McQueen and colleagues. Today I will be discussing my subtopic, a comparative study of USA's entries and policies into both World War I and World War II, under the broader topic, the significance of the United States and international wars in the 20th century. I chose this topic because the preconception of going to war and dying for your country perplexes my young mind in this socially modern 21st century world. It both interests me and forces me to ask the fundamental question of how the USA, a nation that was so far from the conflict geographically, inevitably decided to sacrifice its people and resources for the idea of a greater good. Raymond Grew writes of how comparison is a means to breaking out of the trenches dug by received conceptions, a way of moving out of the limitations of a narrow discipline to a wider field. That allows the research problem to be interpreted in many new ways. A possible argument could be that while America's entry in the First and Second World Wars differed in many ways, both events were significant turning points in American history that shaped the country's identity and global role. The argument can be centered around similarities and differences between the influences to join the wars and the time during them. In turn, trying to understand the impact of the ultimate World War victories on USA policies and its impact on further wars such as Vietnam. For example, you could argue that America's entry into World War I marked a shift from its previous policy of neutrality to a more active engagement in international affairs. This shift was driven by a combination of factors, including Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare, the Zimmermann telegram, and public opinion that favored intervention. Later, I'll be showing 3 propaganda posters used to gain public opinion. In contrast, America's entry into World War II was largely motivated by the attack on Pearl Harbor, which directly threatened national security. However, similar to World War I, the conflict also led to significant changes in American society and its global role, including increased government intervention in the economy, the establishment of the United Nations, and the emergence of the United States as a global superpower. A valuable insight could be that both wars were driven by a combination of economic interests, political alliances, and public opinion, and that the strategies and tactics employed by the US in each conflict were shaped by the specific challenges faced in those wars. It also is important for me to emphasize the lasting impact of these wars on US foreign policy and international relations, suggesting that understanding the lessons learned from these conflicts is important for shaping US policy today. In terms of similarities, there are several that can be identified between America's entry into the First and Second World Wars. Economic motivations, public opinion, and military preparedness are all valid forms of similarities that have been carried throughout both of the wars. In terms of dissimilarities, there are several as well. Timing, nature of the conflict, Axis powers, and international involvement. All these similarities and dissimilarities have arisen from resources which I have been actively engaging in over the last month. Here is a list of primary sources I have been able to uncover during my research. Most notably, primary source 3, the Zimmermann telegram, was a secret communication sent from Germany to Mexico during World War I, proposing a military alliance between the two countries. The USA began to receive close threats from neighboring countries. This telegram indirectly influenced America to join the war, as they no longer had the preconception of being geographically displaced from the war. As I mentioned earlier, The US state used propaganda posters to gain public opinion. Here are three examples of that.
The United States of America and International Wars in the 20th Century. Subtopic: The United States of America in the Second World War and the Vietnam War. How they are connected and the sociological exploration of the good war versus the bad war. Comparative history provides one with the insight to study two different histories and therefore societies as a means of better understanding the complexities behind those societies, their history's narrative, and their change over time. The narrative of the Second World War as the good war and the Vietnam War as the bad war becomes apparent whenever a comparison between the two foreign conflicts arises. Through the comparative history lens, a dissection of the United States nationalism, as well as the sociological framework of the United States in the Second World War and the Vietnam War, provides a deeper understanding into how the perception of the Second World War as the good war came to be realized and set up many of the caveats that would lead to the Vietnam War. After the events known as D-Day on June 6, 1944, the tide of the Second World War, as dominated by the Axis powers, would shift to the Allied powers. The success of the siege would introduce the United States into a new era in terms of international relations. After the success of the siege by the Allies, Germany was left defenseless, and by May 1945, Germany had surrendered to the Allies. However, it was Germany's ally Japan and the United States' actions taken against Japan that would ultimately connect the United States in World War II to the United States in the Vietnam War. In September of 1940, Japan had entered Vietnam and replaced the French as its colonial rulers. However, due to a guerrilla resistance led by Ho Chi Minh, as well as Japan's defeat to the United States, a void was left in the political leadership of Vietnam. Minh believed that Vietnam should be declared an independent state under his name. However, due to the growing strength of communism within eastern parts of Europe as well as Asia, the United States felt that Vietnam should be returned to one of their allies, the French. Minh would then continue his resistance against his colonialist rulers, whilst the United States would financially aid the French in overcoming these attacks. In 1954, the French would lose to Minh's resistance, and the United States would lose any form of control it had over the country. Due to the rising threat of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, and the growing influence of communism in Cuba and Vietnam, the United States would take direct action in Vietnam on the 8th of March 1965, when the US government would deploy 3,500 Marines in Da Nang, Vietnam. The reactions to both the wars are perhaps best represented in the propaganda spread during each respective period, as can be seen in Figure 1 and Figure 2 below. In the Bias Sisters anti-war poster, Figure 2, an almost direct reaction to He Volunteered for Submarine Service poster, Figure 1, can be seen. In that, the Bias Sisters are contradicting the sentiment proposed in old-fashioned World War II propaganda, in that the marketing technique targeted at young men and how that joining the army would make you seem more attractive to women is inverted in their own propaganda piece. The Bias Sisters proposed the opposite sentiment during the Vietnam War, that joining the war would not make you more heroic and would not make you more attractive to women. This World War II poster perhaps pinpoints why World War II was seen more favorably than the Vietnam War, in that the sentiment of joining the war cause would make one heroic and more attractive was widely felt and spread, whereas during the Vietnam War period, the large sociological sentiment was that joining the war was to be frowned upon. The case for comparative history here is that the comparative history can counter set narratives within history. It allows for an investigation into two or more histories and allows for a deeper understanding of many set narratives that we know about the past. In this case, due to the rapid economic growth of the United States in World War II that had pulled them out of the economic and social depression, much of the recollection of the war is remembered more favorably when compared to the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War. These factors are what set the narrative of the United States' involvement in World War II as being the good war, and its involvement in the Vietnam War as the bad war. Through comparative history, we are able to see how these narratives are. Conclusion: the idea of the United States' involvement in World War II as its good war versus its involvement in Vietnam as its bad war highlights the meta-historical narrative present in the perception of the United States' meteoric rise in the economy and its exit out of the economic and social depression of the 1930s. As well as the heroic image that was cast through propaganda, the basis for why it's perceived as America's good war is clear. The violence present in both wars is reason enough alone as to why there can be no such thing as a good war. However, it is evident to see why the sociological perception around the United States' involvement in World War II is seen more favorably than its involvement in the Vietnam War. Here is a list of sources that were utilized for this presentation. Thank you.